The Constitution was written to slow men like this down. That was the entire point. The founders of the United States had already seen what happened when one man could move armies first and explain himself later. They had watched kings drag nations into conflict on ego, instinct, and political survival, so they built friction directly into the machinery of American government. Congress declares war. Congress authorizes force. The president commands the military after permission is granted. Simple, deliberate, slow by design. And yet, on the night Donald Trump was impeached for the third time, the House of Representatives was no longer debating whether those breaks existed. Congress was trying to figure out whether they still worked at all. Because this was not a normal impeachment vote. This was not another loud cable news food fight where politicians pretend to hate each other before walking into the same donor dinner 2 hours later. The accusation at the center of this impeachment cut directly into the constitutional spine of the United States government itself. Donald Trump was accused of ordering offensive military strikes against Venezuela without congressional approval, without meaningful consultation with lawmakers, and without any imminent emergency requiring split-second action. No ticking clock scenario, no incoming invasion, no evidence that Congress could not have been contacted before missiles were launched. According to the articles presented in the House, the president simply decided he did not need permission, and that single detail changed the atmosphere in Washington instantly. You could hear it in the language lawmakers used during nearly 11 hours of debate. Democrats stopped speaking like campaign politicians and started speaking like institutional witnesses documenting a constitutional rupture for history. One lawmaker warned that future generations would ask what Congress did when confronted with behavior they believed violated the constitutional order. Another described the vote as solemn, painful, unavoidable. The framing was intentional. Democrats were not trying to present Trump as merely reckless or controversial. They were trying to establish something much bigger, that a president had crossed a line the Constitution specifically exists to prevent. Republicans responded with equal intensity, but completely different logic. They argued impeachment itself represented the true abuse of power. Congressman Doug Collins mocked Democrats for shifting language from quid pro quo to bribery to abuse of power, claiming that if an actual crime existed, they would have charged one directly, instead of constructing broader constitutional accusations. Other Republicans warned the impeachment would erode public trust in democratic institutions by removing a duly elected president on what they described as empty articles. Watch the contrast carefully because this is where the story becomes dangerous. Democrats argued Trump threatened the constitutional system. Republicans argued impeachment threatened the constitutional system. Same constitution. Opposite conclusions. And while Congress was debating whether Donald Trump had violated the constitutional order, Trump himself was standing at a campaign rally in Battle Creek, Michigan, turning the entire impeachment into political theater in real time. The fight is far from over. We did nothing wrong. It doesn't really feel like we're being impeached. That line mattered more than most people realized. Because Andrew Johnson reacted to impeachment like a disgraced president, Bill Clinton reacted like a politically wounded survivor, Donald Trump reacted like a man live commentating his own constitutional crisis in front of cheering supporters while lawmakers voted behind him on television. The split-screen image was staggering. One side of America was invoking Article 1 and debating war powers. The other side was chanting at a rally while the president dismissed the entire process as illegitimate theater. And buried underneath all the noise sat the question nobody in Washington wanted to answer out loud. What happens to a constitutional system when impeachment no longer shocks the country anymore? Because once a country becomes emotionally numb to impeachment, the entire mechanism begins changing shape. It stops functioning as a national alarm bell and starts behaving like background noise. Another procedural segment squeezed between stock market updates and campaign ads. That normalization may be the most alarming development in this entire story, not the shouting, not the partisan speeches, not even the impeachment itself. The truly dangerous part is how quickly Washington adapted to the idea that a president accused of bypassing Congress on military action could still hold a rally the same night and speak as though nothing extraordinary had happened. And this is where the facts start stacking up in ways that become difficult to ignore. The House did not accuse Donald Trump of reacting to an immediate attack on American soil. The impeachment articles did not describe a situation where lawmakers were unreachable or intelligence agencies were warning of imminent catastrophe. The accusation was narrower and far more damaging than that. Trump had time. Time to consult congressional leadership, time to request authorization, time to explain the intelligence, time to involve the branch of government the Constitution explicitly gives war powers to. According to the impeachment case, he used none of it. Offensive strikes were launched first. Congress learned afterward. Pause there for a second because ordinary Americans understand this principle instinctively, even if constitutional lawyers try to bury it in legal vocabulary. If a CEO empties company funds into a risky operation without board approval, shareholders demand answers immediately. If a police chief authorizes raids without warrants, courts intervene instantly. If a mayor deploys emergency powers without legal authority, lawsuits appear within hours. But when military force is involved, Washington suddenly starts acting as though procedure itself is optional as long as the president insists his intentions were patriotic. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of this impeachment. Republicans repeatedly defended Trump using the language of executive authority, commander-in-chief, national security discretion, presidential flexibility. Yet many of those same lawmakers spent years warning Americans about unchecked federal power in nearly every other context imaginable. Suddenly, the people who once argued government authority should always face strict constitutional limits were defending one of the broadest expansions of unilateral executive military action in modern political memory. The ideological reversal was breathtaking, and Democrats saw the opening immediately. They framed the impeachment not as a personality conflict with Donald Trump, but as a constitutional emergency involving Article I powers. They repeatedly emphasized the structure of the Constitution itself, not vibes, not outrage, structure. They wanted Americans thinking about process instead of personality, because process is harder to dismiss as partisan hysteria. The argument was simple enough for any voter to understand. If Congress alone possesses the authority to authorize war, then a president launching offensive strikes without Congress represents a direct challenge to the constitutional balance of power. Notice what Trump and his allies did not spend much time addressing directly. They attacked motives. They attacked Democrats. They attacked the media. They attacked impeachment procedure, but they rarely sat down and explained why congressional authorization was unnecessary under the constitutional framework itself. Instead, the defense leaned heavily on emotional language: coup, election interference, witch hunt, treason. Powerful words designed to trigger tribal loyalty fast enough to outrun institutional scrutiny. And the escalation did not stop there. As the reality of impeachment settled in, Trump's rhetoric became even more combustible. He accused lawmakers carrying out a constitutional process of trying to overturn democracy itself. Think carefully about how extraordinary that claim actually is. The Constitution explicitly grants the House the power of impeachment. It is not hidden in fine print. It is not an obscure loophole discovered by activists. It is one of the central accountability mechanisms built into the Republic from the beginning. Yet the president was now framing that constitutional mechanism as an illegitimate seizure of power simply because it was being used against him. That shift matters enormously because once constitutional accountability becomes rebranded as political sabotage, every future attempt to restrain executive power starts looking illegitimate before the evidence is even presented. And that is exactly why Nancy Pelosi's next move became so important, because the moment the House vote ended, the battle stopped being about whether Donald Trump would be impeached. That part was over. The real fight shifted toward control. Who controls the narrative? Who controls the Senate trial? Who controls the evidence? And ultimately, who controls public perception of legitimacy itself? Pelosi understood something Mitch McConnell understood too. In modern Washington, procedure is power. Delays are power. Timing is power. Even silence can become power if used correctly. So when Pelosi refused to immediately send the impeachment articles to the Senate, Washington froze. Cable news exploded instantly. Republicans accused Democrats of playing games. Democrats claimed they were protecting the integrity of the process. But underneath all the procedural jargon sat a brutally simple reality. Pelosi did not trust Mitch McConnell to conduct a fair trial, and she was willing to weaponize timing itself to expose that distrust publicly. Listen carefully to the language being used during that moment, because it revealed far more than politicians intended. Pelosi said she needed clarity about what kind of arena the Senate trial would become before appointing impeachment managers. Not courtroom, not hearing. Arena. That word mattered because it acknowledged what everybody in Washington already knew, but rarely admitted out loud. This was no longer functioning like a normal constitutional proceeding. It was becoming political combat staged inside constitutional architecture. Meanwhile, Mitch McConnell was signaling almost the opposite approach. Reports from Capitol Hill suggested he intended to move quickly, minimize uncertainty, and avoid opening doors that could lead to damaging witness testimony. Suddenly, names like John Bolton started hovering over Washington like unexploded ordnance. Because once Bolton entered the conversation, Republicans faced a terrifying possibility. What if witnesses actually testified under oath about internal discussions surrounding military authority, congressional consultation, and executive intent? That is when the impeachment stopped feeling abstract. Because constitutional crises always sound theoretical until real names, real memos, and real testimony begin entering the public record. And this is where the prosecutorial logic becomes devastating. Democrats were not merely arguing Trump made a controversial military decision. Presidents make controversial military decisions constantly. They were arguing something far more structurally dangerous, that Trump intentionally normalized the idea that Congress could simply be bypassed whenever presidential confidence became strong enough. In other words, they were not prosecuting one strike, they were prosecuting a precedent. That distinction changes everything. A single military operation can be debated, a precedent rewrites the future. If Congress allows a president to launch offensive strikes without authorization and faces no meaningful institutional consequence afterward, then the next president inherits that expanded power automatically. Democrat or Republican becomes irrelevant at that point. The constitutional line moves permanently. What once triggered national outrage becomes accepted operating procedure, and over time the public forgets the original limit ever existed. That erosion is how democratic systems weaken in real life, not usually through tanks in the streets, not through dramatic coups with soldiers storming buildings. Democracies often decay through repetition, through normalization, through exhaustion, through citizens slowly accepting behavior that would have shocked them 10 years earlier. And Donald Trump understood that dynamic instinctively. That is why his rhetoric during the impeachment mattered so much. Calling the process a coup was not random anger, it was strategic delegitimization. If impeachment itself can be framed as inherently corrupt, then evidence no longer matters. Constitutional arguments no longer matter, procedure no longer matters. Everything collapses into tribal loyalty. Your side protects you no matter what. The system becomes illegitimate the second it threatens your leader. That mindset is extraordinarily dangerous once attached to military power. Because war powers are different from ordinary political authority, presidents can reverse executive orders, courts can block regulations, Congress can rewrite budgets, but missiles cannot be unexploded after launch. Civilians killed in military operations do not return because lawyers later debate constitutional procedure. Families living near potential conflict zones do not experience abstract constitutional theory. They experience explosions, instability, fear, displacement, economic collapse, and the knowledge that decisions affecting their survival may have been made without democratic consent at all. And that is why this impeachment became bigger than Donald Trump long before the final vote was counted. Because once Congress accuses a president of bypassing constitutional war powers, the argument stops being about personality and starts becoming about survival of the framework itself. The framers of the Constitution understood something modern Washington often pretends to forget. Concentrated power does not announce itself as tyranny at the beginning. It usually arrives disguised as urgency, patriotism, efficiency, or necessity. Leaders rarely say, "I want unlimited authority." They say, "There was no time." They say, "Trust me." They say, "The threat was too serious for delay." And over time, the emergency becomes permanent while the constitutional guardrails become decorative. That is why the historical dimension of this moment matters so much. Andrew Johnson was impeached once. Bill Clinton was impeached once. Donald Trump now stands alone in American history with 3 separate impeachments attached permanently to his presidency. 3 separate occasions where the House of Representatives concluded his conduct crossed the constitutional threshold for impeachment. That is not a statistical coincidence. That is a pattern, and even if the Senate ultimately acquits him again, acquittal does not erase the institutional record. The votes remain. The articles remain, the debates remain. Future generations will still open congressional archives and find page after page documenting lawmakers arguing that a president repeatedly tested the outer limits of executive authority. Trump's defenders insist this proves Democrats were obsessed with destroying him from the beginning. Trump's critics insist it proves he repeatedly acted as though constitutional limits were optional. But step back from both narratives for a moment and look at the deeper institutional damage unfolding underneath them. Half the country increasingly believes impeachment itself is illegitimate whenever their side controls the White House. The other half increasingly believes constitutional accountability mechanisms no longer work because presidents survive politically no matter how many lines they cross. That combination is toxic for a republic. Because democracies depend on shared belief in neutral rules even during political warfare, once every investigation becomes corruption, every court ruling becomes rigged, every congressional subpoena becomes harassment, and every impeachment becomes a coup, the public slowly loses the ability to distinguish between actual abuse of power and ordinary constitutional oversight. Everything collapses into emotional loyalty tests. Facts become tribal, law becomes tribal, even the Constitution becomes tribal. And that may be the real legacy of this impeachment. Not whether Trump survives it politically, not whether Republicans stay loyal, not whether Democrats gain ground in the next election cycle, but whether Americans still believe there is any constitutional line powerful leaders cannot cross without consequence. Because this entire crisis ultimately revolves around a brutally simple question: if the President of the United States can launch offensive military action without congressional approval, dismiss impeachment as illegitimate, frame constitutional oversight as treason, and still retain overwhelming partisan protection afterward, then what exactly remains of the system designed to restrain executive power in the first place? That is the question hanging over Washington tonight. Not hidden, not theoretical, not academic. A real question with real consequences attached to it. The Constitution was designed to slow power down before lives were placed at risk. Congress was supposed to be part of that decision because the framers feared exactly this kind of concentrated authority. And now America is watching in real time as that system strains under pressure from a president who openly treats institutional limits as obstacles to maneuver around rather than boundaries to respect. So when historians look back at this impeachment years from now, they may not remember every procedural vote or every cable news argument. They may remember something much simpler: the moment a constitutional system tried once again to prove it could still restrain power, and the moment millions of Americans stopped believing the restraint would actually hold. If the law only matters when powerful people voluntarily agree to obey it, is it still truly law? And if constitutional accountability can be dismissed as political warfare every single time it becomes inconvenient, what happens when the next president decides to push even further? If you made it this far, like the video, subscribe to the channel, share this with someone following the impeachment battle, and tell me in the comments. Do you believe the Constitution still has real limits on presidential war powers, or are those limits now mostly symbolic?